Welcome to another episode of Global Insights in Professional Security. I'm your host, Michael Gips. Each episode brings in an expert guest to discuss how security intersects with other fields, as well as important trends and developments in the security industry and profession. In previous installments, we've talked about security in leadership, security in the media, security's relationship with law enforcement, security priorities in the Biden administration, security in COVID, convergence of security, and security in branding. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Robert Benn, an expert in insider threats, especially as they pertain to government contractors. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rob. It's really a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Mike. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. Just to kind of introduce myself, my name is Rob Benn. I am the Director of Security Operations for a company inside of the DIB. I also serve as the Insider Threat Program Senior Official, and I had the pleasure of designing and implementing the Insider Threat Program there back in 2016, enabling it to grow and mature and become an effective program. So again, thanks for having me today.
My pleasure. Sounds like you're eminently qualified. So, what are the DoD's biggest insider threat concerns for government contractors these days?
Well, I mean, the biggest concern is the exfiltration of data, in particular classified data, but CUI as well. So exfiltrating that data and then transmitting that data to someone or some nefarious actors, whether they be overseas or domestic. Another concern would be for insiders to give adversaries a backdoor, right, or an in to the company, not just for the purposes of exfiltrating data, but also to maybe do damage or do harm to the company, thereby disrupting the supply chain to the DoD, which is a huge concern nowadays. So those are the two that come to mind off the top.
Yeah, those sound very prominent and important. To what extent is the DoD concerned about? Those are sort of data related insider threats. What about physical insider threats? Something that was carried out by the attack on the Navy Yard by Aaron Alexis, or
Sure.
even cases where you have people storming the government, the Capitol, the insurrection, and it's like, are they worried about any folks sort of? Because a lot of folks were from the military and from the government who did that. Are they worried about sort of the insurrectionist threat from within as well? That seems like something that might be novel that came up.
Sure. So that's been a concern for a while, but it's recently, as you know, it's come to a head. But that's a major concern, right? When you have folks, I'll say, embedded, in government agencies that again can provide insight to folks looking to do damage to that institution. That's a major concern. It's getting a lot of visibility nowadays. But I guess looking at folks' behavior, especially on social media, is one way to kind of detect those insiders and go about maybe mitigating those threats by maybe by changing the culture, right? So
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and I know, as you mentioned, it's a big threat, and it's not necessarily new. That I know there have been cases in the past where there have been FBI and CIA agents were who are affiliated with jihadist causes, and people sneak in there, and they may
sure.
be have neo-Nazi or white supremacist leanings or whatever, and so just it's not new. It's just a new evolution. It's really sort of brought it out, and given that. NISPOM is sort of the guide, the National Industrial Security, operating manual. I forget exactly what it stands for. That's sort of the playbook for government contractors. What does it say, or what does it require for insider threat prevention and training and so forth? And is it just, and to what extent is it about exfiltration of data and as opposed to sort of these other threats we just been talking about?
Right. So the NISPOM talks about all of those threats, not just the exfiltration of data. The guidance from the NISPOM is for industry, right? To develop a program that's able to detect, deter, and mitigate an insider threat. Um, the training is an annual training, typically for classified folks that hold clearances. The better programs include uncleared folks as well, and it's the training, and I'll go back to the beginning, but the training for the folks in industry should include the importance of detecting an insider threat, what to look for, making them aware of the behaviors of concern. Most importantly, giving folks insight into the methodologies that adversaries use to recruit them, right? So they'll be able to recognize it, in their day-to-day lives when they're traveling for conferences. Things like that. There's also a counterintelligence element as well that should be incorporated into the training. So that's kind of a broad brush of what the NISPOM requires. As I stated, some of the better programs insert a methodology to detect and prevent an insider by coaching that employee, right, to make them a better corporate citizen, and helping him or her along, right, out of any of the difficulties or with the stressors that they may be um, that the stressors that they may be experiencing at the time. So
Sure. And that's really interesting, sort of intervening or even before intervening, just treating an employee respectfully and well. There was a recent case where I think it was Tesla, where there was a Russian engineer who was working for them, and he was approached by a Russian agent, and who was trying to get some information and some secret information or sensitive information, and the engineer sort of worked with them, sort of played along for a few days, and then called the FBI, and they ended up capturing the person who tried to work him. And when asked, why he turned him in, his compatriot in, he said that he owed the United States for sort of welcoming, giving him a job, and he owed the company for treating him well and giving him an
right.
important job. So, I mean, that sort of is that sort of the baseline. It's like if you treat them well, they'll sort of bend over backwards for you.
Sure, absolutely. They feel like they're a part of the company, right? Not just an employee. When it comes to companies' responses, an overreaction can be just as bad as no reaction at all, right? You could actually drive that employee to want to do harm to your employee. So when you offer, when your insider threat program is designed so it's designed to actually help the employee out of difficult times, you actually bring that employee closer into the fold where they feel an allegiance to the company and the country as well. So
I'd like your opinion on something now that you mentioned that. I was on a webinar a few months ago talking about insider threat, and one of the presenters was saying that in some cases, it's effective to sort of tell people that to sort of float something out there as like a false, sort of tempt them with something, and if they can withstand it, it's like, oh, I'm contacting you to get information, and if they report it to security, then you sort of tout it and say, oh, this guy's a hero, he did the right thing. But and again, if he doesn't, if the person kind of goes along with it, then they've got a bad apple. But it always made me wonder, is that something you want to do to your workforce? That won't they be suspicious? And he did say, it doesn't work all the time, but I was curious of
right.
your thoughts on that.
I mean, in my opinion, that's kind of a double-edged sword, right? It depends how the employee interprets that what I'll call like a fish, right? Almost like a
Mm-hmm.
penetration testing. They could take it like, well, why did you pick me, right? Is there something about me or my behavior or my performance that prompted you to kind of try to bait me right into this activity? And so it depends. I would say it's a it could be, like I said, it could hurt you, I think it could hurt a company because it depends how the employee takes, and that really goes back to the culture of the company, right? And their you want your insider threat program to I think I heard it say more like a big mother than big brother. So
I
it
like that.
has, yeah, I heard that somewhere, so I'm not going to take credit for it, but I think that's the kind of approach that works best.
Oh, I'm gonna have to use that properly attributed. I'll attribute it to you, who might attribute it to someone else, but I like that. So, um,
Yeah.
so you talked about, obviously you want to prevent this from happening before having to intervene. So, what are predictive methods, specific predictive methods we can use to mitigate insider threat?
Right. So in my experience, it's really about behaviors, right? And just from an employee performance kind of standpoint, right? You want to make sure that with all the pressures that some of these employees are under, that the companies are under to deliver and deliver on time and things like that, you want to make sure that they feel appreciated and they don't become disgruntled. You want to make sure that any performance issues that may be detected that are addressed, right? Again, I'll say it again, that are addressed in a way that you're looking to assist, right, and help the employee. Stress can make folks do things out of character, right? So I think it's important to try to identify, recognize the stressors, whether it's in the professional or the personal environment, and then and act on them to again assist the employee. So that's my take.
I'm glad you brought up stress because I'm going to ask you about COVID. And COVID and the shift to telework have drastically altered the threat scenario. Um, how should defense contractors, really anybody, handle exacerbated threats like increased mobile access, device sharing, use of home networks, seeing classified documents perhaps at home, and then, as you said, staff depression, stress,
Sure.
home strife. People might have lost sources of income, and they're trapped at home together. That's a big change from that's just sort of putting it all into a cauldron and stirring it around.
Right. So that's a great question. Some of the things that companies can do to kind of mitigate the threat to their organization because of the times that we're in is reducing the opportunity, right? If something does go sideways with an employee, for them to do harm to the company or exfiltrate data. One of those ways is applying least privilege, right? So the employees at home, making sure they only have access to the files that they need, um, and thereby reducing the footprint significantly. Monitoring VPN logins and login times. Really, paying attention to the performance. I mean, your performance of the employee is going to change because now they're at home and things are a little bit different. But you'll be looking for significant changes in performance, and you can gauge that by having conversations with the coworkers, with their supervisors. If it is a dramatic shift in the employee's performance or their attitude towards the company, even just kind of checking out, right, and not doing the regular day-to-day stuff can be an indicator. It's a tough spot for the employer, um, especially because the workforce is now deployed, right, all over the place, and you don't have that direct connection that you used to have where you could just go knock on their office door. So it's something that companies have to be vigilant about. But I think um, you know using the technology that's available to the company is a way to kind of mitigate that, and just doing like wellness checks, right? Just checking in, how's everything going, that kind of thing could be beneficial.
Yeah, no, that's. I think you've hit on something there. Regular communication, regular check-ins to see check on people's well-being is a great idea. You made me think about with everyone working at home, defense contractors. I know defense uses skiffs, right? To
Yep.
those facilities that sort of kind of like soundless, like sound doesn't get out, and you can't um, grab any sort of data from it. Can Are people using those things now to go? I mean, plus they're tight, and you don't want to be in there with too many people, even if you're wearing a mask. So have the parameters around use of those, and with people working at home, are there fewer conversations going on where you'd actually need a skiff? I'm curious about that.
Sure. Well, I mean, I can say a lot of companies are deploying different protocols when it comes to being in close contact inside an area like a skiff, even closed areas as well, where testing may be required for the folks that need to be in the skiff to make sure that they're not positive as they interact, wearing a mask, things like that. There is technology out there that will allow employers to kind of do contact tracing automatically by allowing having employees wear some sort of Bluetooth device. I'm not sure how well that probably doesn't play in a skiff, but in other tight spaces, it's something that can be considered. To kind of help with that.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. What about with COVID, 90% of offices are still vacant, or 90, they may have some people working there, but it's far fewer than before, and they're really not going to open up and fully until mass vaccination or some other prophylactic measures are taking place. What about at defense contractors, where there is sort of more need for like secure communication and person to person? Are they seeing any? Are they bringing in any more people than the skeleton crews that other businesses that aren't dealing with government sensitive government information are dealing with? Are they opening up more or less? How's that going?
Well, I mean, the manufacturers, the folks that actually touch the hardware, right, and the engineers that support those programs are, back when this whole thing started, were considered essential workers, right? So that's kind of still the case. All the administrative functions, those folks are home, still working from home, supporting the business, but the assemblers, the engineers, the test techs, all those folks have been, being diligent and coming into work and doing what they need to do to support the nation's warfighter. So
Great, and they're staying safe with the proper protocols, obviously social distancing and
sure.
masking, and yeah, that's good to hear. Um, so I want to, we talked about what we can do to, prevent this and these sorts of cases. We're all aware of notable failures, like obviously Edward Snowden. He was a contractor. That's probably the biggest, at least um, most uh, most consequential exfiltration of information that I can certainly remember. With many other cases, and with Aaron Alexis, the Navy Yard shooter,
Hmm.
one of the biggest sort of physical consequences of an insider threat. So we hear sort of those cases, and can you tell us about cases where something was interdicted, and obviously if it was prevented, you're not going to know because security doesn't necessarily document what doesn't happen. You can't.
Right.
But how about cases where you kind of found out early enough that you were able to do something, and it would be nice to hear a success story.
Right. So the case that comes to mind to me most recently, and it doesn't involve a government contractor, but uh, the impact is still the same, and that's would be Anthony Lewandowski, who is an engineer. I believe it was for Google, and he spearheaded their driverless car program. And right before he was getting ready to exit the business, I believe he downloaded almost 10 gigabytes worth of data, and then left and started his own company with that data, and then in turn sold that company to Uber, right, with uh, uh, intellectual property, right? Fortunately, he was discovered in it. It was. an inadvertent discovery, right, where an email was seen with Google's technology embedded in the email. But I think that would be considered a success, being that uh, it was the act was discovered and the company was able to act on it. And I mentioned that because I keep talking about data exfiltration. I mean, that's an important piece to any government contractor. You want to pay when you have an insider threat program. It's one of the things you want to pay attention to when an employee is leaving, either voluntary or involuntary. That you go back and check, right, to see if there's um, any significant data downloads, especially to removable devices that are maybe out of character. And that'll help you pick that up, detect that activity before, right, that data escapes and ends up in someone else's hands. Not necessarily a nefarious actor, but you're talking about industrial espionage at that point. So, like you
Yeah,
to your point, the successes typically don't make the paper. So I'll use that one as an example.
yeah, that's an excellent point. And along those lines, not only when someone's leaving, but whenever there's sort of some disciplinary action against somebody, it's probably a good idea to check a little more. I say that because there was a big case involving it was COVID related. It was a gentleman, I think he was the vice president of finance at a company in Atlanta, and what they did was ship PPE, and he had some sort of infraction, and he got suspended or something, and they were um, and before they did anything with his credentials, he created a sort of a fake account, under someone else's name
Hmm.
with privileges. And then later on, he came back and was reinstated. He went back into that account and created another account with the same privileges. So he actually got fired, I don't know, maybe a year later for something unrelated, but it was, someone has disciplinary actions taken against them. It's probably not, too much of a stretch to say they might be having a problem. Anyway, he got fired, but he still had at least one of the two um, accesses to the system. And he deleted users, he deleted addresses, he changed things, and it actually prevented the company from sending several thousand masks and other personal protective gear to hospitals and other people who need it. So it had real effects. And it seems to me the lesson from that is if somebody is under, disciplinary action, why don't you kind of check to see what they've been doing, and creating new access points for themselves, new login credentials. That's a
Sure.
huge red flag. Um, so, given stuff we're talking about for the government, government requires background investigations, obviously for positions and periodic rescreens. But it didn't stop people like Aaron Alexis. It presumably didn't stop Edward Snowden. I don't remember whether he had something that occurred that would have been flagged in a rescreen. But there's a trend in called continuous monitoring of
Hmm.
employees, where if I'm sure you know what it is, but for the audience, if you show up um, uh, on an arrest report, or you have a prosecution against you, a guilty plea, you show up on a no-fly list, you may have a license revoked by a state authority. It pops up on this list, and if you're subscribed to the service, you can figure out, okay, this person is getting sued for whatever, or they have a drunk driving conviction, and then it lets you sort of say, oh, this person could be a problem. Now that in some cases there could be Fair Credit Reporting Act implications, so you've got to think about that. But is that the way to go? What do you think of continuous monitoring versus the current system of background investigations, and then maybe 5 years later, periodic rescreen?
Right. Right. So continuous evaluation or continuous monitoring is definitely the way to go, in my opinion. A lot can happen to an employee in the period of 5 years or 10 years. The way the reinvestigations are structured now. So being able to, especially as that information enters the public domain, right? being able to see that information and monitor it kind of gives you some insight of what's going on with that employee, or with that person, I should say, between the periodic investigations. You mentioned about the financial health of that person. There could be some, criminal activity, whether it be a DUI or something like that. Um, or it just points to the behavior of that person. And again, I'll go back to the behavioral piece. It kind of gives you an indicator of where that person is, and what may be happening, good or bad, in their life. And again, it gives you the opportunity, right, to kind of step in and help, um, or take away that access if necessary. So it's a good practice. I'll go back to the first point that we were talking about, when we talk about disciplinary action for employees. I'll go back to that for a second. So that's an important behavior of concern as well. Not necessarily the behavior, the disciplinary action itself; those things happen, but the person's reaction, right, to that discipline is key, in my opinion. If they do something wrong, and they admit to the wrongdoing, and take corrective action, that's one thing. But if they react a certain way and kind of don't take responsibility for it, that is, that's definitely an indicator, for me. So.
Great point. That about wraps up the time we have. This has been a wonderful conversation. You've made some very enlightening observations. Just want to give you the last chance. If there are any last thoughts you want to leave us with, final points.
Well, I mean, I just want, for the folks that are listening, I just want to point out a great resource, and that is the CDSE. I use that's the what is that acronym for?
Yeah, I know. It's at the tip of my tongue too. I'm
It's
actually
on the
going to look
tip
it
of
up.
my
Well,
tongue.
yeah,
Oh, okay.
it's
The Center for Development and Security Excellence. There it is. So
thank
that,
you.
for the folks that are listening out there, that maybe starting up their inside threat program, or have one that's starting to mature. That's a best place. That's a really good place to go for resources. They have job aids, toolkits, posters, things like that. It's really helped me in the development of my of the program that I'm engaged with. So that's kind of the last point I would make for those that are listening.
Super. Thanks again, Rob. It's been a real pleasure and very helpful to our audience.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Appreciate it.
Yep.